Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Crucible. I'm your host, Andrew Wilson. I was at a wedding all weekend, and I'm still hungover because I was drunk for 3 straight days. So I'm trying to ease myself into moderating this debate and get rid of my horrible mood. Because not only is there a vegan moral anti-realist, yay, that's just my favorite, going up against, you know, uh, Joseph Sweden on the God question, but I'm also just in a bad mood because of this awful hangover. But luckily, next to me, I have vodka, which is helpful, and so hopefully that'll like ease me into this thing. You know, maybe somehow I can ease myself into this into this debate. Is God as real? Debate. Is God real? If God real, why bad thing happen? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Kidding. Joking. The fuck is everybody? Is my what's going on here? Yeah, I don't think so either. Why am I not live? I don't know either. Hang on. Let me find out why I'm not live. What's going on here? Joseph, you're live, aren't you? Why am I not live? There it goes. There we go. I think I'm live now. I don't know what the hell happened. I think it's good now. Check it real quick. Yeah, it's good now. Get out of here, cat. All right. So, for reasons I have no idea why, the YouTube gods have decided to smite me and make sure that I wasn't live. I had this great intro where I was making fun of like, a fucking moral anti-realist. The whole nine. It was great. It was a wonderful intro, and I don't even know if any of you caught any of that, except unless you were on Joseph's side. You know what I mean? I was totally clowning on one of the debaters like I always do. I'm sure that this is going to be a great debate. Okay, I'm sure it's going to be awesome and epic in every way. I'm looking forward to it. I've got some vodka right next to me. Try to ease my way into this, get rid of this awful hangover that I've had for the last 4 days. Boomer performing to himself. All right. All right. Without further ado, let's get this debate started. So I'll tell you guys a great story just before we get this debate started. So that intro song, it has a hard cutoff, just like it just ends. And for a year straight, this other streamer named Made by Jim Bob, who's a real prick, by the way, just couldn't help but make fun of it every chance he got. Well, the artist got a hold of me and he's like, we can extend that and like I'll ramp it down, this and that. I told him no. Because I know how much it irritates Made by Jim Bob. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Crucible. Nick, this is your first time on the Crucible. Why don't you take a second, shout yourself out, tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, I guess I'm not like super active on like any social media. I got a Threads and then I used it for 2 days. I don't know. I really do Twitter much. So yeah, my name's Nick. Usually you find me around the parts. I go by Anti-Carnic because I'm legally obligated to tell you that I'm vegan, considering it's the first 30 seconds of conversation. Yeah, and I guess I'll be taking like the atheistic position here on this particular debate. So,
okay, and then Joseph Swaden, you've been on the Crucible a couple of times. Happy to have you back. Happy to give a platform to everybody, even if we totally disagree with them. That's okay. That's what we're here to do. Go ahead, take a minute, shout your channel out to everybody where they can find you.
Sure. As you can see underneath my headline, it says nft.net. That's our main kind of hub. It's our website where we do things. We also have a YouTube channel with a similar name. It's NFT True Orthodox News and Apologetics. So you can always find us there and see what's going on. And yeah, y'all know me here.
All right. Appreciate that very much as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everybody know I didn't even post the Dono chat link. I'll get the Dono chat link posted up. It's been a fail for me all night, right? Just not in the right frame of mind, but it's okay. All I expect from you two is to adhere to moderation. I'll keep the conversation on track as best I can. I expect after your 7-minute opening, there'll be somewhere around hour and a half of back and forth before we get to call-ins and super chats. So expect a full show tonight. Appreciate very much both of you guys coming on. With that, Joseph, I'll let you start with your opening statement. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm going to be honest. When I first started thinking about this debate, I was going to approach this from one particular angle, and that was I was going to approach it in terms of miracles. Really, when we're talking about orthodoxy, when we're talking about Christianity, we're ultimately talking about leaps of faith. We're talking about the difficulty of believing what seems to be impossible. I was going to tie that in to talking about things like the holy fire or the reversing of the Jordan River at Theophany. These are phenomena that, quite frankly, often defy scientific explanation. There have been attempts to debunk them, etc. Bring it down to the question of people being healed spontaneously through holy relics, which we've seen that in cases, sometimes with no medical explanation on the part of doctors who would check out those cases afterwards. But ultimately, what it all comes down to is that we tie these things together to the ultimate miracle, which is, can a man rise from the dead after 3 days? They're all tied together with that. If Christ is not resurrected, then our faith is nothing. And I thought that was going to be the way I was going to go. I thought I was going to have pictures. I was ready to say, I have a presentation, but I don't have a presentation. Along the way, I started realizing I had been reading an essay. I sent it to you, Andrew. It was a historical essay about Montaigne and the rationalists kind of making league with the Roman Catholic leadership in Western Europe against the Calvinists. Basically, it was an argument for skepticism against the claims of faith that the Calvinists were making. But ultimately, within it, there was a poison pill, because the fideism of these people ultimately required that you cede, at least, that all of reality is questionable without faith. The rationalists, of course, took that to the next logical step, and ultimately the question of whether or not there is whether or not there is a God, was now a 50-50 question. It all depended on the person, and ultimately made it more subjective. This, unfortunately, would have further repercussions further down with Descartes. Finally, you get to the 20th century and the rise of mass atheism, and even in the West through, capitalistic means. If it sounds like I'm making two different points here, I am. The first one, of course, being the clear reality of miracles and what they do and how often they are, and also the historical development of where we got to in the 20th century, where basically atheism was held as a de facto equal standard to the religious stance, or to religious belief. And then that was my second argument. So I was going to do that, but then that didn't seem fair either. Nick, I'm sure you're not afraid to state that you were previously once Orthodox. I have a responsibility with this black robe on, to not simply watch a person who's given up. And when I say, I know you're not going to do what you're saying. What do I mean, give it up? The reason for the miracles and the resurrection and so on and so forth, there's a meaning behind it. And that meaning is ultimately the salvation of our souls. That's what all of this stuff is about. So when, somebody who's born and baptized Orthodox walks away from it, I'm like, how could you walk away from something that has value beyond your imagination? And so these are some of the things that we're going to be addressing, I think, over the next, couple of hours. So besides the miracles, besides the history, how we approach it, philosophical approaches, I really want to understand a little bit more about your mind and where you are, and see where that goes. Okay, I'm done.
All right. With that, you ceded your time. You had a minute left. Nick, you're going to have the same amount of time. That's 7 minutes on the clock. Go ahead when you're ready.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Nick. I was, as Father Joseph has mentioned, born, baptized, raised in Christian Orthodoxy. Actually went to a Catholic high school. I know a fair amount about Protestantism, so I feel like I'm pretty well versed in terms of like theology, and like, I don't know. I mean, obviously there's with any field of study, there's an infinite amount to learn. And then I actually was for a while there convinced that not only was Orthodoxy true, but that the earth was 6,000 years old. Because it was just kind of funny. I ran across like Kent Hovind videos online, and then I was like, wow, this guy, everything he says makes sense. And over the course of like the following year, yeah, I guess it's kind of funny. I see Andrew making a face there, like, and he was sort of like, it's interesting, I guess, because he was like a Protestant, but I was like, well, I guess he's wrong about his theology, but he's, but I don't know. I guess like I was caught up in everything that he, said, and yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the things he said turned out to just be like mistakes. And then over the course of the following year, I sort of lost that belief when it became apparent from the because the evidence was stacked such that there were a bunch of things that were impossible to happen under evolutionary theory, right? Like any kind of like macroevolution or whatever. And so as I discovered that gradually more and more of those things became possible, then that fell apart, and I just kind of continued questioning everything until eventually I think I, began questioning about the God claim itself. And yeah, I, when I was in grad school, I sort of landed on a position that I think like best explains what it is I think. And I think it kind of, because there's a lot of, when you ask people like, what's atheism, what's theism, you get like a bunch of different answers about like, what is agnosticism? Is it a subset of atheism? Like how does that all relate together? So I think the position that clarifies all of that tremendously, at least for me, was the idea of isognostic atheism. So not agnostic or agnostic, but isognostic, meaning that we have the same knowledge that we would see, or we would think that we would see if we lived in a universe in which God didn't exist or operate. Or like, yeah, we live in, or like, I guess you could say like that we live in a universe, yeah, that is indistinguishable from one in which God doesn't exist, or yeah, God is indistinguishable from non-existing. I guess there's a bunch of different ways you could kind of state that. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's, I think that for me kind of clarifies it a lot, and it sort of eliminates a little bit some of these things that you can have where you can get kind of into like Pascal's wager or something like that. But it honestly doesn't even make sense to say like, well, we should pretend as though we can distinguish God from not existing. Like, you could pretend to believe, but you can't pretend to be able to distinguish something from its non-existence. So yeah, I guess like the thing to recognize is that the thing that I like eventually found and I recognized was that if you just think about the kind of the beliefs of theism and atheism, it's not as though they're two beliefs that are side by side. In fact, one is wholly contained in the other. So atheism is a subset of theism in a way, if you think about it that way, because there's sort of a more limited set of mechanisms by which things could happen under like a naturalistic worldview, especially. And so in this case, it's not a matter of saying like, there's nothing that's going to be better explained on atheism categorically. That's just trivially true. You could always claim that God is the best explanation for everything. God is the best explanation for why Honda discontinued the 6-cylinder Accord, like, because he just wanted to teach me about the brilliancy of the K20 platform. I mean, we could just go through everything, and God just could be categorically the best explanation for things. But the thing to recognize is that because the atheist observations and atheist mechanisms are a subset of theism, referencing things in terms of distinguishability is the thing that makes the most sense. So that's kind of where I sit. So yeah, I guess I just don't see that, like, the mentioning of any of these miracles in particular, or like this idea of like all of reality being questionable, like it doesn't actually attempt to demonstrate, I think, well, at least maybe the miracles kind of do, but the all of reality being questionable in some way or anything like that, like, just it doesn't looks like a pro Magic Gathering player. Actually, I used to play it in high school, but I haven't actually played it in a long time. Needless to say, my parents, who are Christian Orthodox to the point where my dad brought a book into church to read prayers from while service is going on. Church wasn't enough church for him. He needed additional church. He's very religious. So yeah, he was not too pleased that like there are cards that are like sorceries and so on, with me being interested in Magic the Gathering. But yeah, anyway, so that's kind of like, I guess, my position and my kind of history a little bit. And so, yeah, I guess we could take it from here.
All right. Appreciate that opening statement very much. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get started, remember that dono tab is there and that you should send me all of your money. And the reason that you should do that is because regardless of rain or shine or snow or horrible Michigan weather, or no matter how hungover your good Irish host is, I will still be here giving you the best moderated debates anywhere on YouTube. That's why you should do that. And you should also become a member because of the same reason. I'm running out of shit to say. Just become a member, send in super chats, do all the stuff you're supposed to do. With that, the floor is open. Gentlemen, go ahead.
Well, thank you for that. The first thing that I was going to note is that I noticed that we're kind of seeing this whole kind of, I guess you could say, the question of if there is a dichotomy between religion and science. I've never seen it that way. Science is constantly in revision. 150 years ago, miasma theory was the standard scientific position on illness. And we're still seeing massive changes in things like quantum physics. A lot is left undefined. And ultimately, I think people call that the God of the gaps. I don't really want to make that argument. My focus in this is ultimately because when we get right down to it, if we start arguing like, is God, just basically the answer for things that are left unanswered, that's a generic God. That's not the God that I know as a Christian. And what I mean by that is that when we're talking about the evidence, say, for Christ and for the church and the resurrection, etc., these are personal experiences. That's why I was kind of surprised by. Well, first off, by the way, I played Magic: The Gathering in high school. I don't think it's that big a deal. I mean, the point is that I don't know what happened exactly. Now here's another question I have, because this is something I want to understand. You mentioned your parents were very religious.
Yeah.
And, I'm not sure why somebody would bring a book to the services unless they were helping to, like, follow along, like if they're doing like going to like extra liturgical services like Vespers or something, and they're trying to like in general the Sunday liturgy is pretty repetitive, so you eventually don't need a book.
No, he was like reading like I don't know if it was like gosh, now I'm like trying to remember. I mean, like this is like maybe I don't know how youthful I look.
I'm
This
sorry.
is a long
I'm
time
sorry.
ago, but yeah.
I've got to actually derail this back
Sure.
to the conversation.
Yeah.
Let's get into the arguments here.
Yeah, so I guess with like the God of the Gaps, I think that would be like, you saying something along the lines of like that's not where you want to take it. I think that's probably a good move, because I just don't see how like that, for instance, would demonstrate any kind of distinguishability. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that's all I would have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the real question here, and I think that it's right to demand the highest standard when we're talking about things of faith. And the simple reality is, it's frankly, the church has the ultimate and highest standard. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned in the intro, if Christ is not resurrected, then our faith is worthless. Ultimately, it comes back down to the crucifixion. And the resurrection. I believe, and that we operate on certainty because of witnesses, the apostles and those who came after them, that hold on, excuse me. Hi, yeah, don't bite that. In any case, my dog is co-starring. So then basically we operate, for lack of a better word, on testimony. But further than testimony, there have always been manifestations of the miraculous. These things generally remain heretofore unexplained. As a matter of fact, it's most interesting that when I was reviewing the history of how skepticism basically became the central argument in Catholicism and then kind of turned on itself, the one reference that was made to miracles was that it was the ultimate proof of God. And the reason why is because ultimately, if you can say, Lord Jesus, help me in some bizarre circumstance, no matter what it may be, and somehow he helps you, it's reasonable to infer that he might actually be there. Now, one could make that argument with other religions, and that's fine. We can discuss that. But ultimately, what we have to do is we have to examine the claims of whether or not the church is real. And it's a high standard. I'm aware of it, but we have to deal with the real standard, not simply an imagined standard, if that makes sense. So that's part of why I was asking Andrew about Nick's history, because I want to understand where he was in his orthodoxy when things went off the rails.
Yeah, I understand that, but this isn't really the place for it. This is the place to argue. And what I want to get into
I'll get meaner. Hold on.
Right.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say that, like, so for instance, with the resurrection, like, really, when we talk about things in terms of like distinguishability, right, like we don't really have witnesses. What we have are like the texts that we have, right? And like from that we infer the idea of witnesses, or we refer, we then infer what we think that happened back then. But yeah, I mean, I guess like if you wanted to make a claim that like somehow, the text that we have now is just like incompatible with a naturalistic worldview, then yeah, I mean, unless there's some incompatibility that you could demonstrate, then like I don't think that there's necessarily anything for me to like rebut them. Like it wouldn't actually demonstrate that God's distinguishable from not existing. You know what I mean? I mean, if you think about like even like Islam actually has like a much stronger set of reporting and lineage of reporting going back I mean, I guess obviously you can argue back and forth as to like which one is stronger, and then like, you know, you can get into like a whole debate there. I mean, but needless to say, it's not completely incomparable in some way. And so I don't know, would you accept that? I mean, you presumably wouldn't accept it for Islam, would you? I mean, like, why should
Well, I think
why
that
should anybody accept it for Christianity?
I think that when we're talking about the transmission of the religious beliefs, etc., they're radically different. In the case of Christ, effectively the resurrection and the announcement by the apostles, I realize you're saying we only have records of the apostles, but we also have records that they were all killed and willing to die for the belief that a man resurrected. Further, subsequent generations, all the way till the legalization of Christianity, were all willing to die for the belief that a man rose from the dead. This is a pretty strong belief to have in those early centuries. And ultimately, what we'd have to argue is that it was for no reason. By contrast, if we're talking about Islam, they had a series of reciters that followed basically a local Levantine warlord as he plundered and pillaged the Middle East. And then basically he made them recite it. They tried to take out bad parts. There were countless arguments over what was actually correct. They used the term sahih, etc., to judge authenticity, which means that they even kept recordings of the inauthentic stuff and hope for you to figure it out. And then it's not, in no way, shape, or form could I compare these two things. Plus, on top of that, the talking about the prohibition on apostasy, that right there is honestly the primary reason that Islam has survived in the 21st century, and with the advent of the internet, that's vanishing, whereas we're finding more and more people becoming Christians. So I would say that the entire process is different on both sides.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the political climate that both of these grew up in was completely different. Yeah, and so yeah, I completely acknowledge that. I just like I mean, like when we say records, it's worth keeping in mind these are like verbal records that were
one of the things
were decades and decades after the initial events in which they supposedly report. And when we're talking about extra biblical evidence for these these sorts of things, I mean, we're looking at I mean, basically we really just have, I mean, there's Josephus, there's a few things here or there scattered about that like record the existence of this phenomenon, essentially, of early Christianity. We don't really have like a good understanding of exactly what's there, but I don't even know if necessarily like the apostles dying for something demonstrates anything, like unless you're willing to accept that, like, for instance, people like the Heaven's Gate cult dying, I mean, those were people that were willing to die, to kill themselves for their beliefs. So I don't think that necessarily just the willingness to die helps me distinguish this from being true or not true. I don't know that the records that we have, quote unquote, helps me. So I'm still kind of left empty-handed as to like what it is that we actually have here that we're looking at in terms of like, how am I distinguishing this from just, essentially just a fiction that was believed very strongly by some group of people throughout hundreds of years. That's fine. I'm perfectly willing to accept that. People could be willing to die for it.
Well, the problem with this is that, first off, you're talking about probably the best attested book in ancient history. There are literally thousands of manuscripts of the scriptures. But more importantly, to compare it to the Heaven's Gate cult, what I would say, you've actually brought up a very good point. While I would say that the Heaven's Gate cult was absolutely deluded and wearing Nikes for the alien overlords to come get them when they took their cyanide pills, however, ultimately, the big thing that we can establish here is that the Heaven's Gate cult was real. Am I correct? So yeah, so it was
a much more recent thing.
A much more recent thing, but you have to understand that when we start going down the rabbit hole of was Jesus real, that even the most modernist scholars do admit he was a real person, because the evidence was there, the documentary evidence was immense for Christ. And if we start using that reductionist, well, we have proof. You can't find proof for George Washington. Unless we'd have to hopefully exhume his grave. Maybe there'd be something there. Once you start getting into the theoretical question of, is this real? I have to ground it back because Christ was real. We can debate the resurrection. We can say his apostles were deluded. They were definitely real. People kept parts of their bones. Those are in churches. So I want to deal with the real of the claim. And the real is not, did Jesus exist? There's no doubt. It's not the apostles exist. There's no doubt. It's, was Jesus God? And did he resurrect himself? That's the question.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I've listened to a fair amount of Bart Ehrman, I don't know, maybe like a decade ago.
The Muslims.
But like, you know, I mean, so it's not clear to me that the belief that God, like that Jesus was a historical figure is, you know, incompatible with. Oh, sorry.
I don't know if you know this, but Bart Ehrman, I think it was like 2 years ago, clarified that in fact, after complete review of all the documentary evidence, he is convinced that Jesus was a real person.
Yeah. He's in fact he had a debate with numerous people that were you know, historical or historicists, so that are convinced that in fact it's more likely that Jesus was not a real person. And the debate there goes back and forth. Again, the fact that it's like the most copied book doesn't help me distinguish the truth of the book, because it could just as easily have been that's just a question of motivation, not necessarily a question of the, you know, veracity. And when we think about like the thousands of copies, as Bart Ehrman points out, there's actually like disagreement as to like the contents of some of those copies. The, you know, they just straight up were copied incorrectly. And so here, like, once again, we have
scribal errors. Are we really going to discount stuff because of scribal errors?
Well, I mean, I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily why I'm discounting things. I'm just saying that, like, I still just don't see how any of this is incompatible with like essentially naturalism. Like,
now, when you say naturalism, I assume you mean a belief that, you know, that there is a kind of naturalistic explanation for everything that happens, correct?
Yeah, except I wouldn't necessarily phrase it that way, because if you you know, it's not necessarily contingent upon your ability to find that naturalistic explanation.
Okay, how in a naturalistic explanation do people come back from the dead?
Oh, hang on. Before we start speaking past each other, Nick, would you just take a moment to clarify and define what you mean by naturalism?
Yeah, I would just take that to be like the sum total of like you know, because you could easily take like a position like atheism, but then I mean, nominally, when you think about it, like Scientology could technically be atheistic, right? And so, because that doesn't necessarily entail the existence of a god itself or like the supernatural, and like a, you know, in a then it starts to get into like a little bit of like what modality you're talking about.
Yeah, but just like very concise.
So, right. So it would be the sum total of things like, you know, all of those types of things, including theism, you know, astrology, and I would even include in that the simulation hypothesis, like the fact that all of those things are all indistinguishable from fictions.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I guess you know, well, you go ahead. I mean, but I don't. I'm failing to see how this is like incompatible with naturalistic worldview.
I've often considered the simulation hypothesis of late, because it is very interesting to me, and would provide me with at least some sort of explanation for the changes in my own life. That said,
you asked me, do people come back from the dead? That's what it was. You asked me, do people come back from
after 3 days?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's not the question, right? The question is, do we end up with texts where people come back from the dead under a naturalistic worldview? And considering that, like, yeah, we have incompatible the claims being made of resurrection in multiple religions, then
there's a minor problem with that.
I mean, the question, that's not the question, right? That's asking the wrong question.
The problem with that is that there's even documentation of opposition to the belief in the resurrection. I don't know if you know this, but there's actually Roman graffiti making fun of Christians from the 1st and 2nd century.
Yeah,
because
I
of
actually
their
didn't know
belief
about
in,
that, but that's cool.
because of their belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So
Sure.
there's no question that there were people who believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the first century. There were also people making fun of those people in the first
Sure.
century. So the question that whether or not it exists or not is moot. We can establish that at the very least, there were definitely people believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, even if
Yeah.
there were also people who thought they were insane. We can agree on that, right?
That's just trivially true. Yeah.
Trivial. How is it trivially true?
I mean, that's true that people believed it, but that's the question, isn't it? Right? I mean,
well, the question is actually whether he was resurrected,
right.
not whether we had to go through the weeds a little bit to get to this point because we had to establish that people believed it.
Sure.
But the point is, once we get to that, the question becomes, was the claim true? I would argue, and I have, and I mentioned it a little bit before, that the main motivation in the apostles being willing to be martyred, and their followers being willing to be martyred, that much of this occurred because of experience. I would argue, and now granted, we could talk about the Heaven's Gate cult, etc., because they had some crazy beliefs and they had a delusional cult leader. They certainly thought he was telling the truth. The question is this: why would such a large group of people, because it was a large group of people, it even mentions that in Acts, and there's a lot of evidence that there were a large number of people, even though there were a large number of people who didn't believe in it. Why should we immediately discount the claim of the resurrection? Like, in other words, what makes it false to you?
Oh no, I'm not like I don't know. I wouldn't phrase it that way. That I'm like discounting the claim.
Okay, so you're open to the idea of the resurrection.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm not saying that, like, it's not as though, I don't know, using the phrasing that, like, it's discounting the claim is maybe, like, not quite my position. I would just say that, like, essentially, what I would need is some demonstration that, like, the evidence that we have is just incompatible with, like, a naturalistic worldview.
Well, like, to get back to your original point, the idea that the world we live in is functionally, the same as a world in which God does not exist, ultimately gets tested against that claim. In a world where God does not exist, do people come back from the dead in 3 days when they say they're going to? Yes or no? The answer is no. They don't. Most people just
but that's not the question, right? Like, you would concede that that's not the right question. The right question is because it's not a question of, like, the thing is that you can't distinguish. It's not a matter of distinguishing on the basis of what actually happened. It's distinguishing on the basis of the observations that you have. So the observation that we have isn't that Jesus rose from the dead. Obviously, if that was our observation, then I would have to accept that claim. But that's not what we have, right? What we have are these documents.
Well, no, we can go further. I can point to Miracle of St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, who he died in 1966, where literally he did healings, including bringing people back from very recent death, usually within the period of brain death, by simply saying Christ is risen. By simply touching people, he was able to heal them. He was also hated by his synod, etc., and died in pain, but he was glorified as a saint in 1994. These are far more recent examples using the exact same belief system of the people we're talking about in the documents. We have photos of St. John. The point I'm trying to make is, and this is why I'm bringing up stuff like the Holy Fire, etc., is because the world of the miraculous is not something that is detached from the present. It's still miraculous.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to, like, I guess, like, move on to miracles, we can, but I still don't see that there's anything that's with the resurrection. Like, just to wrap up the resurrection discussion, still, like, not clear that there's anything there that's, like, incompatible with, like, a atheistic worldview.
People don't come back from the dead. That's
right, but that's not the claim, right? The claim is that we have these documents, right? So you would need to demonstrate that the existence of these documents, which is, like, the actual observation that we have collectively, that's incompatible with atheism. Okay. I just don't see that that's incompatible. Like, the existence of these documents is incompatible.
Okay, but the documents were written down because people believed in the events in the documents.
Sure.
That's yeah. So the point is, in that worldview where God does not exist, these people are writing about something that makes no sense.
I mean, it doesn't make no sense. That's being completely disingenuous to their beliefs. I mean, it makes sense to them.
Is that a regular occurrence? Because they seemed pretty surprised by it.
Yeah, people write down things that aren't true all the time.
So that's interesting. So you're holding to the kind of conspiracy argument that the apostles kind of conspired together to write this Jesus stuff down, and then all basically committed, suicide by death by cop over a period of 30 years. I'm just curious as to how that works. Well, 6 years if we're being technical, because St. John died on Patmos at like 80, 90. But
yeah, well, I mean, these things weren't written down like actually like committed to physical form beyond like verbal tradition for quite some time, nearly a century. So
no, that's not true. You're actually wrong on that. The Didache, for example, can be dated to 80-50. The Epistle to the Romans can be dated, I believe it's to like 55 to 62. So that would be a difference of 25 to 30 years. And that's only when we're talking about like surviving manuscripts.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, I'm not familiar with those particular documents, but
the Epistle to the Romans is in the Bible.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. So I mean, I guess I just still am not clear. Like it's not a matter of a conspiracy. So let me go back. I mean, like I don't think that like necessarily there's like some, I don't know, conspiracy makes it seem as though like it's like something that's like some group of people that are in power. Like,
well, believe it or not, the conspiracy is actually mentioned in the gospel. When his body's gone, the Pharisees get together and they say, we'll say that they stole the body together or something. And so that's in the scriptures themselves. Like, so that's my point, is that there was already an atmosphere of disbelief, even in the scriptures themselves, in the possibility of this.
Yeah, I mean, if I
humans
had
don't just come back from the dead after
I mean, if I had some fantastic claim, I'm sure that I would try to include in my documentation that that there's going to be people that don't believe this fantastic thing happened, and this is probably what they're going to say. I mean, I still don't see that that's necessarily incompatible with, again,
that's not what happened. But I mean, it's kind of a misphrasing. But because the simple reality is,
I'm just giving one possibility, right? But I mean, like the possibilities here are endless. It's not a matter of like me trying to come up with like some counter
parallel universe with no God distinction. The people making the claim that the body was stolen were right. It's the one that makes the most sense. Occam's razor.
I mean, I guess you could, like, the problem with like the using Occam's razor is that like you could then like trivially just claim that like the thing is that Occam's razor doesn't work that way, right? Because it's not actually simpler in the way that you want it to be.
Is it easier for someone to come back from the dead in 3 days, or is it easier to steal a body and then say they stole it?
Yeah. So the way that Occam's razor works is I think that you're equivocating on what it means by a claim to be simpler. So the thing is that most claims that are simpler tend to have a property, and that property is the thing that actually makes it the default. And that property is that the claim is much more unfalsifiable than the contradiction. That claim is much more falsifiable than its contradictory, unfalsifiable counterpart. And so when one claim is a subset of another claim, like for instance, an atheist worldview is a subset of the theistic worldview, because God could always behave in a fashion that's indistinguishable from him not existing, right? Then you can't, if you accept that the default is the superset view, then you can never disprove that. And so then you would be forced to accept a bunch of contradictory propositions, because any superset claim that comes along, you would give that the default and it could never be disproven. Like, you do this every day, and like everybody always does this. Like, one great example is Hanlon's razor. know if you're familiar with that. So it's never attribute to malice that which could be explained by incompetence.
Yeah.
Right? And so why is that? Well, because somebody who's malicious could behave in a way as though they're trying to hide their malice, right? Like nobody's going to be like overtly an a-hole 100% of the time, right? So they could like play along for a little bit and then betray you, right? Or something along those lines. And so because of that,
this is why the razors usually use the qualifier usually or generally,
right? Well, yeah.
So
So when you think about like, yeah, in statistics like the null hypothesis, right? Again, that's just another thing where you have this superset belief, and that superset belief must be superseded by the subset belief, right? And only when you start to find things that are outside of that subset belief encompassed by the superset belief, you accept the minimum possible superset, which includes that claim. And we do this all the time.
Let me just ask you this, because I think we're getting a little confused here. Okay, there is an empty tomb, an empty grave, if you will. Is it more logical to believe that someone stole the body, or is it more logical to believe that someone came back from the dead and walked out?
I mean, given the mechanisms of action, I think, I mean, I would say that it's probably I would say more reasonable to believe that the body was stolen.
So, well, the reason I'm asking this is because that would mean that the authors of the Gospels took into account the most logical reason being given by the opponents of Christ and recorded them as well. So they, in other words, in the Bible itself, it literally gives this reason, which you thought was kind of like done for preemptive purposes, but they clearly put it in there because they believed that the existence of Christ and the fact that he was alive to them and their belief was far more powerful than the normal claim. The simple, sorry, it's a dog.
Yep. I mean, I still am failing to see that like them including detractors in their text is somehow demonstrates the truth of the claim.
It's not just the detractors. The detractors are all over the Gospels. That's not what I'm referring to. It's the claim that makes the most sense. They're putting the claim that makes the most sense alongside a claim that makes far less sense, which is that Jesus came back from the dead. As a matter of fact, they run with it. That's the whole point of, the ends of the Gospels and the epistles, etc. So clearly they're not even concerned if a person wants to assume the body is stolen at first. Ultimately, what it comes down to is, and this is why St. Luke in the Acts refers to the proofs of Christ from the original gospel, because the proofs, what they meant there were not logical proofs, they were physical proofs that, if we read the scriptures, Christ appeared to the apostles and he appeared to the 70, so on and so forth, then he ascended after 40 days. So the idea that it was just, you'd have to kind of take into account the fact that it's more than just an empty tomb that they're claiming here. They're making a massive claim. And so I would think on your end, it would probably be easier to just say, well, that makes it easier to reject. But it seems like you're finding it difficult to even go there.
No, I mean, I'm just failing to see what, there just hasn't really been an argument rendered as to why it's like incompatible with naturalism. I mean, I don't even necessarily take, I mean, like you had sort of like you had this dichotomy you gave me of like resurrection or body being stolen. I don't even necessarily take that to be like the actual dichotomy within.
Because in a natural world where God doesn't exist, only one of those possibilities makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, again, what we're doing is we're fast forwarding through a bunch of stuff where we only really have documentation that is followed decades and decades after the fact.
Well,
again, that's the observation that we actually have here, right? So like that set of observations hasn't really been rendered to be incompatible with naturalism.
Well, except the resurrection from the dead part. But okay, so let's continue on.
No, like that's the point of contention, right?
Yeah, but that's my point, that it cannot exist in that worldview. I cannot. I mean, maybe
sure.
I mean, one could make.
I would grant that. Yeah.
Okay. The reason that I brought up also miracles, because that's what's coming up next, is because the Holy Land, even though it's getting, bombed and crushed right now, and I can't make too much of a comment on it, I assume, because YouTube.
Hold on, did you? Sorry, did you want to like render an argument as to why it's incompatible with naturalism, like the documents that we have? Because like if there's no incompatibility with naturalism, then like that just wouldn't be a means by which I could distinguish God's non-existence.
But the problem is that your argument presupposes that it's simply a claim, whereas I'm talking about the concrete reality. If Jesus Christ existed and his body is gone, that we believe he's resurrected, that can't actually happen in a universe where God does not exist.
Yep, that's true.
Good.
Absolutely.
So now we can move on to the rest of the world, and I have a purpose to that.
Well, hang on, we're not done here, because I don't want to move on until we like finish this thing, because either there's like some demonstration that the observations that we have surrounding the resurrection are incompatible with naturalism, or like that's just not a means by which we could distinguish God from non-existing.
The problem with kind of asking whether Christianity is, or the claims of the resurrection are compatible with naturalism, is that, when we're talking about the author of nature itself, you start kind of the question of whether it can naturally or unnaturally occur. We have to give some point to the supernatural. I think we've established people don't come back from the dead after 3 days. This is just a basic thing. And so if that claim is being made, I would think that it is incompatible with a completely naturalistic worldview.
Yeah, that's just trivially true. That's
what does
incompatible.
Trivially true mean?
That's true, but that doesn't mean anything.
Well, you see, there's the difference. To me, that's everything. To you, that's barely
so
anything.
when you go to distinguish something from something else, right? The thing is that you don't do it on the basis of the thing itself, right? You do it on the basis of your observation of the thing. That's what it means for something to be indistinguishable, that you can't distinguish it, right? And so if we're talking about something like the resurrection, this distinction that we're making, we have to be the ones to make it, which naturally has to be filtered through the observations that we have, right? Would you concede that distinctions happen on the basis of observations, not on the basis of like the thing that actually happened, because that's not necessarily accessible to us, right? The only thing that's accessible to us is the observation.
Once we go down that road, it's the question of whether George Washington's real again. I mean,
no, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, but I don't want to live in that world. That kind of world. So we have where is breakfast real? I mean,
no, you're making a complete continuum fallacy. Actually, I would say that's far beyond a continuum fallacy. That's almost a category.
I don't even know what a continuum fallacy is, so you could tell me about it.
Right. So a continuum fallacy would be when you sort of, you state that, clear lines can't be necessarily drawn. Right. It's arguing about the aerodynamic, like what it is that makes something aerodynamically, favorable. And then what we're doing is we're talking about a brick, right? That's just a continuum fallacy, that the discussion we're having isn't over here. This discussion is way over on the other side. And so I think that like when you talk about making distinctions, right, you are distinguishing things based on your observations of the thing. And of course, we're making distinctions based on like the observations that we have surrounding George Washington. I'm not familiar with the evidence that surrounds the existence of George Washington. Never really looked into it personally.
There are people about the existence of George Washington.
Yeah. And then, well, the claims about like, are your breakfast real? That's just like a category error on modalities. That is not necessarily very. I mean, we could go down that route, but that's not.
But we could, and that's exactly my point. We could do that. Go through the question of whether sense knowledge is real. We could go through. I mean, we're taking a lot of things for granted. Once we accept.
Do you know what I mean by when I say modality? Like when I say like making like a necessity claim on a different modality. So this is something that's actually kind of interesting. I don't know, maybe like the viewers might enjoy this explanation, but like, so the idea is that let's say, for instance, to talk about 6-cylinder accords, Let's say I said it's impossible to buy a brand new 6-cylinder Accord. I could mean that on an empirical modality. So what that would mean is that Honda doesn't make a 6-cylinder Accord anymore. Okay. So that's one modality. That's quite a different claim from me saying that it's impossible to buy a new 6-cylinder Accord because ownership involves the existence of the thing being real, and I'm claiming that we live in a simulation, right? That would be something like a metaphysical modality on which I'm making that impossibility claim. Or you could make it on a logical modality, which I guess in that case wouldn't necessarily work. But like in the case of, like, let's say a 6-cylinder all-electric car, right? All electric means no combustible, 6-cylinder means combustible. That's like saying a squared circle, right? And so then that would be impossible on a logical modality, and so on. And so those are all different modalities on which you could be making that impossibility claim or that necessity claim. Because ultimately, this is a necessity claim that I'm making here, right? That there's nothing that I find for which basically reaching outside the naturalistic worldview is necessary. So when you ask about your breakfast being real, that's on like a more of a metaphysical or like maybe a nomological modality. And what I'm talking about here is way back over here, back in empirical modalities, right? But modalities are the easiest way to sound fake deep. You can find people, on Twitter, right? Where it's just like, not to mention any, maybe former professors from Toronto in psychology, their favorite way, I could be literally talking about anybody, but, people like that love to make these kind of, mid-conversation change the modality, and it makes it sound like they thought of everything. But modality is like just a very useful concept to think about these things. So in terms of like this resurrection, I don't need to concede any kind of like modalities that are like far and beyond into like the metaphysical. I'm just talking strictly on an empirical modality here. Does that make sense?
No. It sounds to me like basically you've got a whole bunch of different levels of reality that you want to talk about. And in one of them, somehow people come back from the dead after 3 days. Must be totally normal. I'm just really trying to understand you here.
Yeah. So like what I'm saying is that like the necessity claim that I'm making regarding that there's no claim for which the theistic worldview is necessary, right? Because if that's true, then God is indistinguishable from not existing. So that necessity claim, I'm not making that on some kind of metaphysical modality wherein I start questioning if my breakfast is real, or I start talking about,
I mean, we could. I'm just saying.
Yeah. What I'm saying here is that this is purely on an empirical modality, right? So I just mean it way back down at the level of like the observations that we have. Obviously, like if you look at like the Durham-Quine problem, this is like
what problem?
Durham-Quine problem. So it's it's basically a statement that sort of says this, that like, anytime you make any kind of observation or any kind of necessity claim or any kind of hypothesis or anything like that, you're bringing with you all this baggage, right? And so that these claims don't necessarily stand alone. They have all of these things all packed into them, all of these other kind of deeper questions.
Like St. John of Shanghai that I brought up earlier, who was healing people by the thousands in the 1960s. The reasons for this, of course, are basically his preparation and knowledge and spiritual level in the faith. My question to you is, how do all those things happen?
Yeah, well, we'll get to miracles in a second, but I just want to talk about. I want to finish up here with the resurrection, right? Like,
well, it's tied to the resurrection because he believed in the resurrection.
That's fine.
That's part of what.
But that's not the distinction. That's not the means by which we're trying to distinguish God's existence from his non-existence. So I just don't want to move on before we finish this. The thing is that even on an empirical modality, is my claim, even when we're talking about the existence of God, just on a completely like not even asking all these questions about like, is my breakfast real or anything like that, I don't need any of that, right? I'm still stuck at the empirical level of just the things that we observe empirically, right? I can't on that basis make that distinction from God's existence or God's non-existence from the observations that we have here in the universe that we exist.
The reason I chose the resurrection is obviously because it is the problem of Christianity. When it comes right down to it, the moral teachings that Christ held that you can find in the Gospels, including the teachings about God as Father, and thus our personal relation to him, ultimately are things related to what he taught. They're also related to why they killed him. But the point is, those things, and if the resurrection, as I mentioned earlier, is false, then our faith is in vain. What you're talking about now is if the resurrection is true. And if the resurrection is true, then the things he said about God also become, for lack of a better word, validated. Because if he's saying,
I'll accept that.
Okay. So then we now can add into this the moral teachings and the spiritual teachings of Christ. I would argue that St. John in 1960 was following the same path as the apostles, because we believe in apostolic succession, and then from there to the apostolic fathers, from there to the church fathers, all the way down to the present day. We believe, because of Pentecost in the book of Acts, I don't know how familiar you are with the book of Acts, that the Holy Spirit came down upon the church and that it would stay with the church until the end of time. Effectively, this is one of some of the earliest Christians. You may have heard of St. Justin Martyr. St. Justin Martyr argued that Christians may be few in number, but once there are no Christians, the world ends. So the point is that there's a lot to go with just at the very beginning in terms of their level of understanding of not only Christ's teachings, but the truth of the resurrection, etc. And that's been passed down to people like St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, who was glorified as saint in 94. He died in 1966, and countless other saints, millions of other saints, in fact. I can point to an Orthodox calendar on any given day of the week, and you'll find a whole list of people who performed miracles, who died with grace, etc. It's an unending, unbreaking chain, if I may, of just massive, massive testimonies for this empty tomb. Are you starting to see where I'm coming from here, in that what I'm saying is that it's not simply a single experience or a single teaching, but it's all part of a chain that connects together. And
okay, that's totally fine. I mean, what I was discussing here, though, was specifically the text surrounding the resurrection.
Okay.
That those are not in any way anything that meaningfully distinguishes God's existence from his non-existence.
Well, except they talk about his fatherhood. They talk about him being the creator of the universe, and they talk about him being, the first person of the Trinity. These concepts are in those same scriptures. So if the resurrection is valid, all of these things become valid as well. And that makes the most logical explanation for why things like the rivers turning on the Feast of the Theophany every year, reversing course on the day of Christ's baptism. And that's something that's been recorded from time immemorial. The holy fire, which people have tried to unsubstantiate for ages, but thanks to YouTube, people can actually see the pillar of fire forming from the sky to light the candles of the believers on a day that changes every single year. Now, why? Now, this is one of the things that I find problematic with this whole kind of, what's the word you use, that kind of thing? What was it? The things?
Modalities
there you go. Like, what I find is that with the modality thing, what's happened to people who have kind of basically become giant categorization machines is that the supernatural, the unexplainable, the weird is now being handled by guys like saying aliens and ridiculous shows on the History Channel. Mankind needs an explanation for the supernatural. And the ultimate supernatural act is the one that occurred at the resurrection. What I'm saying is that we pose a fundamentally different worldview as Orthodox Christians because we believe in the presence and the reality of God. And as a former Orthodox Christian, that's why I kind of get blown away, because how could anyone who holds the truth of the faith of reality itself in a mystical and powerful way ever let that go? That's another question. I wanted to make the point.
No, I mean, like, I would just say, like, obviously, like, it just became clear to me that, like, I was essentially just interacting with a simulacrum where I couldn't tell the difference between the thing that I was interacting with and just being essentially a fiction, or like just a just so story, just a retelling through some lens that we just subsequently, just some post hoc rationalization of the facts. And but anyway, yeah, I mean, I guess like, so then would you concede that on the basis of like the text surrounding the resurrection, that like we just don't have any way to distinguish God's existence from non-existence, and we would have to then go lean on other things?
No.
Okay.
I would argue that direct experience is precisely what connects us to God, and because those texts specifically say that if God is our Father, we reach out to him directly. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't understand and has been kind of dulled down in modern society over time. But we believe in the direct contact of God and man. This is a process that's referred to as theosis, but I don't want to get too Greek and philosophical. The idea is that God reaches us personally. And through that personal experience with God, he becomes more and more real in our lives. This is something that's really hard for people to understand, especially now, because there's so many things that distract us from the reality of God. The most religious people you find are usually the poorest people, as well as the most rural people. And the reason for this is because the poorest people usually deal with the most struggle, and God becomes real to them that way. And the most rural people have more access to God's creation than anyone else. And so they reach God that way. We tend to see...
Yeah, again, like, I just don't see you're still like failing to render an argument as to why like the fact that they're poor, and like, let's say somebody is struggling, is somehow like we have two alternate explanations potentially, or like we have like a whole pantheon, for lack of a better word, of explanations here. One of them would be that God is in fact real, that they're interacting with, but they could easily be deriving such value from interacting with a simulation, right? Like kissing a photograph, right? Yeah, I mean, like, you can still feel something even though you're not actually truly interacting with that person. Like, there's nothing...
Well, how do you know that you're not truly interacting with that person?
Kissing a photograph, like, I mean, like, just like a random photograph, like if I just had a picture sitting on the desk.
I'm asking that question.
Well,
I realize the implications for everything from taking an icon to pornography, but yes, I'm asking that question. Like, how do we know that you are not, in fact, interacting with that person on another level? It's a real question. It's actually relevant. Look at the icon behind me. That's quite relevant.
Right. No. Okay. All right. Fine. Like, I guess, like, iconography aside, right? I mean, just like, if I like
pictures,
right? If I just have a picture, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Like, I mean, again, like, this would just have to be something that's substantiated, that like there is like some other like plane on which, I don't know, I guess like me holding a photograph tenderly it's like somehow like interacting with something, like, is actually making some sort of interaction that the other person, I don't know, gets an itch behind their ear or whatever. Like,
but in many cases, especially with iconography, we're talking about the repose. But let's say that you ask for something before this particular icon, and you ask for God's intercession, and whatever it is you need happens. Well, what's your explanation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like in that hypothetical, the problem is, of course, like, you've injected into that hypothetical quite a bit.
I've injected basic Orthodox intercessory prayer.
Yeah, I mean, but you're saying like in terms of like what you need. Well, I mean, like in some cases, what you need could easily be obtainable through like naturalistically intelligible means. So like then that wouldn't be incompatible with atheism.
Okay.
Like if I pray for a sunny day and then tomorrow it is a sunny day, like that's not incompatible with atheism.
Common sense, because it's always going to be a sunny day and then night or not sunny day. But just to give you,
well, I mean, like, as opposed to a
let's take it up a notch, right? Though. How about stage 4 cancer? Like, what about that? Like, what if you ask, Christ's icon or the saint's icon to heal your mom of stage 4 cancer, and then it's gone the next day? Like, what about that?
Gone the next day?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like there's obviously more to that type of a thing. Like, I'll
tell you a funny story about that. I'm believe it or not, you're not going to believe this, but I consider myself largely a skeptic. And back in 2016, our synod held a meeting, and we were referring to the case of an elder Theodore Ertel who passed on at the Abbey of the Holy Name, and apparently he worked in Alaska, and he had this cross, like he had like a desk cross. It was like a blessing cross that was on the table. So they went to his old cell. This was probably about 20 years ago. But what ended up happening was, over time, people began reporting that people who were touched with the elder's cross were being healed from cancer. And these reports had grown to about 8 or 9 that we had documentation for, where we literally had to call the doctors and say, did this person really have stage 4 cancer? Did this person have stage 3 cancer? And yes, did it vanish? How quickly did it vanish? Like, so I'm not making up a hypothetical. That's the funny part of this. I'm actually talking about things I see in my life. And by the way, when I heard this, I was shocked and horrified. I was like, what the heck's going on? It can't all be real. That can't be real. But it was, I mean, the doctors said it happened and they wrote it in their reports. What am I supposed to say to that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I guess this is just like, I mean, there's plenty of like obscure things you can find people claiming all the time.
Aliens.
Yeah, I mean, like you can find similar claims that are, you know, with well, I mean, actually, this is an interesting question. I don't know if do you actually believe that ghosts exist? This is actually a good question.
Spirits, you mean, like souls and spirits? Yeah, I do.
No, like ghosts.
I would think most ghosts that we talk about in paranormal terms are usually demons.
Okay, but like, so you don't think that like ghosts themselves exist in the way that like people claim that they do?
You mean like people sitting around a house for 500 years? No, that's a demon. Because this human soul goes up within 40 days.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, like, yeah, I mean, like people have all kinds of claims there, right? I mean, I guess they'd say that they're all like compatible with like your view, presumably.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess they're also compatible with the jinns in Islam, right?
Well, the jinns have a mountain in Islam. There's like the mountain of the jinns, and they all come from there and go all back and forth. So yeah, that's just no.
I mean, that's a different claim, sure, but I mean, like again, like there are all kinds of other religions and all kinds of other Eastern mystics that have interesting properties that you can find that are claimed by people. Yeah, I guess I don't see why I have any reason to accept any of those. Why people making those claims? And again, it's not the person. But again, it's like it's not the person that's healed from stage 4 cancer that we're arguing is incompatible.
But it is for me. Well, yeah, but I'm saying that.
Yeah, right.
I'm still looking for an explanation.
Again, this like chain of reporting of like this thing that's like not very easily verifiable of this like person in Alaska. Reports. Yeah, I mean, doctors can be wrong easily. Doctors are wrong. Yeah, doctors are wrong.
Tools and technology.
I mean, obviously, like I don't have
with coincidentally the same people that all touch the same cross.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have any of the details of this. I mean, like you bring up obscure things. I tried even actually Googling like the reversal of the river, and I found it on like
reversing of the Jordan.
Jordan. Yeah, I guess. I mean, obviously, a lot of stuff comes up about the Chicago River reversing. So, I mean, that like reversing rivers isn't necessarily even like a naturalistically unintelligible thing. I don't know enough about the Jordan itself.
No, but it occurs specifically on the baptism of Christ. Like that would mean that the phenomena occurs every year. Same thing with the Paschal fire, which again moves. It's not the same day of every year.
Yeah, I tried looking up that, that was like a thing where it seems like some people who are involved in it say that like, oh, we just have like this.
I see you read Wikipedia.
Well, I mean, just from Google, just like from a quick Google search here and there, there's like a story from 2001 in the Telegraph about it, that there's people that are on either side of it. That again is just like not clear. I mean, like the fact is that like a lot of these things just don't even.
Guys, I'm sorry. There's no great time to wrap up a debate, but I want to give you guys plenty of time for your closing statements before we start getting callers in here. So who opened first? Was it you? It was Joseph, right? So Joseph, I'm going to give you the last word. And Nick, I'm going to let you close first. I'm going to give you the same amount of time, 7 minutes for your closing statement. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I guess I don't know what to close here because yeah, I mean, like none of this stuff is like incompatible with like a naturalistic worldview. These are just like, you know, on the basis of like the actual observations that we have regarding any of these things. We have, again, in all these things, conflicting reports, you know, things where people, you know, whether it's the resurrection or we're talking about like these miracles and stuff. So I guess I don't know. I don't know what to conclude from that. I mean, if there was some way to distinguish God's existence from his non-existence, unfortunately, this debate was not it. It's not the way that will get you to that distinction. End of speech.
Okay, appreciate that very much. I'll go ahead and stop your 40-second closing and move over to Joseph. You have 7 minutes on the clock. Go ahead when you're ready.
Sometimes people ask me, why do you do these debates? And it honestly, sometimes I'm really not ever sure of the answer. Sometimes it seems that the reason I do them is just because I feel it's something that I can have a good discussion on. But in this particular case, when we're talking about the existence of God, and we're talking, about, Nick being formerly Orthodox, I wanted to understand the why. I'm not much closer to understanding. I assumed it was, I figured it was kind of the philosophy thing, but I guess what I was not able to understand is where's the baseline for reality. And that's part of the reason why I brought up the miracles, because ultimately, when we talk about people being healed from cancer miraculously by a cross from somebody who knew my bishop, that's as real as it's going to get for me. These are people I knew, I can talk to, and that chain goes on all the way to the apostles. But the same things are still happening. Things that are impossible or should be impossible are occurring. And that's why, again, I'm curious. One of the things that I wanted to kind of figure out was in what paradigm does arguing the faith work today? We've been through, I believe, kind of a phase where from probably the post-Tridentine period to the 20th century, we've reduced everything to logical postulates. What I'd like to do is see if we can get back to things that seemed obvious to people, that are as real as they can get. And in that, we include things like the resurrection because of all the things we see and what God does in our lives. Ultimately, it's not that God isn't very visible to people. I've spoken to many people who feel he's the most visible person on earth, sometimes more real than people. But if we choose to always say, maybe not, then we won't actually see the reality that's in front of us. It's losing the forest for the trees, if I may. So my hope is that, Nick strikes me as a very intelligent person. He strikes me as somebody who really does, this philosophy stuff really, really good. But in the end, and I'm addressing this to you, Nick, it's about your soul. And I would advise just, I don't know if you believe in a soul or not, etc. But if you have your old local church you used to go to, maybe give it a visit and maybe ask some questions. And that's really the only, if anything, maybe everyone in the audience might think this was kind of a clown's debate. But this debate I chose because I wanted to ask you and hopefully see if you'd think about that.
Yeah, I'm doing the mistake of reading the chat.
Never,
I don't do that.
Never read the chat.
I never read the chat.
Never read the chat. Chat's for me to read. You don't ever read the chat. You never read the chat. All right. Well, with that closing, are you done with your closing? You still had a couple of minutes. Okay, great. So with that, we're going to shut down that portion of the debate before we bring in callers, but we do things a little bit differently at the Crucible. One of the things that marks us away from all of the debate channels, once the debate is closed, closing statements are done, The moderators do often participate with questions of their own so that we can kind of, we pick up on a lot that happened during the debate, and we have the privilege of being able to ask some of the questions that didn't get asked. So I do have a couple for both of you before I bring callers in. I'm going to start with you, Nick. Nick, do you believe that any objectively moral facts exist at all?
Yeah, that's like a good question. This is something that I actually like kind of went back and forth on with some people. I guess I sort of like ended up coming down to, I think I sort of was convinced by anti-realism. So that
So no
like
moral facts, no moral facts exist at all. Not a single moral fact.
well, that they would be contingent upon other things, right? So that they would be contingent upon, like, I guess ultimately that I don't know necessarily what like a moral fact existing means in a world in which, let's say, moral facts or like that thinking minds don't exist. So like if we assumed like a completely naturalistic universe,
Yeah, but we wouldn't presuppose that. There would be no reason to presuppose that. So if we're not going to start with the presupposition that that's true, but we will ask, do moral facts exist?
well, I would say yeah, but they would have to be they would exist in your mind, and they would be contingent
Well,
upon
then
other
those
things that
aren't
you believe.
facts. My mind's
Right.
different than your mind.
Right. Yeah. So then in that case,
what would
then
make it a
no,
fact?
right. Yeah. I guess. Yeah. So then in that case, using those sets of definitions, I guess I would say I would be
You'd say
convinced
no?
that I would say no.
So
But I could be convinced otherwise.
So
yeah.
kissing a baby and hugging a baby is just as moral as raping a woman or killing the baby.
No.
Well, that's a moral fact. You can't say that is no, because that would then make that a fact or a moral fact of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, like what you're talking about is just like well-trodden, I think, territory in terms of like.
No, it's
moral
not. It's
realism or
not well
anti-realism.
trodden. I don't understand it. Why would you say no to this question, knowing that you just previously to this question said there are no moral facts? How can you then make the declarative no, which would be a factual statement?
No, wouldn't necessarily be a factual statement, right? It would be like a statement of contingency.
Are there no moral facts? The answer is yes, there are no moral facts. That's what you answered.
Yeah.
2 seconds later, I ask you, so then if there are no moral facts, then it is equally moral to kill a baby or hug a baby.
If the basis is purely independent moral facts that exist independently of a mind.
Well, then these are, since everybody's mind works differently, you can't ever say that whatever you believe is moral and what I believe is moral is not moral.
Well, yeah, but you could demonstrate something to be irrational.
No, well, irrationality, even if you could determine that it is irrational, it would not make it immoral, except with the presupposition that rationality and morality are the same thing. If you admit that there are no such thing as moral facts, you are admitting that it is completely equivalent morally to open up with an AK-47 on a crowd or to go in and feed the crowd. They're morally equivalent. Factually, anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is that like even in that example, right? Like, is that, for instance, a war zone, right? And then that changes those.
It doesn't change anything.
Facts.
It wouldn't matter if it was a war zone. It wouldn't matter if it was a psychopath. It wouldn't matter if it was some rando crazy person, and it wouldn't matter if it was a saint. None of those facts would matter because there are no moral facts, Nick.
Well, I mean, like you just said opening up on a crowd with like an AK-47, right?
Yeah, but
if
who
that
cares?
crowd is a bunch of,
it's not.
What if that crowd is a bunch of people? So it's not even a fact. It's not even like a universal fact under your worldview.
Well, there's no moral facts under your worldview. No, under my worldview, there are moral facts because I believe in objective.
So it's wrong to stab someone.
I believe in objective morality. Yes, it's wrong to stab.
Oh, well, what if you're a surgeon?
Yeah, well, then it would be correct to stab somebody.
Oh, so then the situation would change. So then you would say that then that's not a universal moral
that
fact.
Would still be
wrong to stab
no.
someone.
Now you're running into the continuum fallacy.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Now you're running into the continuum fallacy yourself, aren't you, Nick?
Okay, what's the continuum here?
Well, the continuum is that you're saying because two things can exist in constant modes, that this means that they cannot be distinct things. It's a distinct thing to say self-defense versus murder. One would be unjustified, one is justified. Same thing as a surgery would be a distinct thing from a murder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That otherwise you would end up with the continuum fallacy yourself, which is the same thing that you accused.
Yeah, that doesn't interact with what I said.
Joseph Sweden. It does interact with what you said. Not only
No, it
that, you
doesn't.
did say that there are no facts. There are no moral facts. If there are no moral facts, then you are claiming that all of these things are equivalent to each other, at least from a moral standpoint. How could they not be?
Yeah, I mean, like, we just go, I don't know. Did you want to actually have this debate, or like, I don't know if like.
Well, it's only going to be a couple more minutes. I mean, you might as well engage with it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess like, yeah. So stabbing someone's not even like a universal moral fact on your worldview.
Why do you need to know my worldview in order to know your worldview, Nick?
Well, you're saying that.
Why do you need to know my worldview to know your worldview, Nick? So one more time, Nick, there's no moral facts, are there? Doesn't matter what I believe. It doesn't matter if I think that there are, there aren't, or there's some, or there's none. You believe that there are no moral facts at all, right, Nick?
Yeah, I guess I'm not necessarily really convinced that.
So then it isn't equal. So then why don't you just bite the bullet and tell the truth and tell everybody here that is exactly morally equivalent, whatever anybody does to anybody else or any group of people at any time to anybody else, and you have no justification otherwise.
Right, except for like the whole rationality bit.
That's not justification because it presupposes that we should follow rationality. Why should we follow rationality, Nick?
Well, I mean, like, so that would be like the moral primitive upon which, so on the basis of that moral primitive. But if you reject rationality, then what's the point of even having a conversation?
Well, no, wait a second. Why should we presuppose that we should use rationality for ought claims of morality, Nick? And if there are no objective morals, why is it that you would ever say we can use rationality in order to figure out what is objectively moral? That's insane.
No, because things can follow. Like you could have a disagreement about like
how could they follow? Primitive. How could it possibly follow, Nick, to say that you don't believe that there are any objective moral facts whatsoever, and then say that we can utilize rationality, though, in order to see if something logically follows to determine if it's moral or not? That's literally a performative contradiction. Your whole worldview just concaved in on itself.
I don't understand what the contradiction is.
Okay.
If I make a statement, no, because if I make a statement about yeah, I know you're trying to get your little sound.
That makes no sense, bro.
No,
what
like
do you mean?
If you have, so like I would just say that then like all of those like things that you call moral facts are contingent upon you accepting rationality. And if you just refuse to accept rationality, there's no point in having a conversation about
but why should rationality be the consideration of what is a moral fact? You could have a moral fact external to rationality. I have no idea how, but you could do it. And since you and I would agree that that could be done, there could be a moral fact, I guess, absent rationality. Why is it,
I don't know, Nick, that's true,
that we have to make everything contingent upon rationality? I don't understand.
How could you have a moral fact that's not contingent upon rationality?
I have no idea. It's irrelevant. But if you could have a moral fact, because it would be a fact then, moral, you could do it through like, God. That you could say that there's moral facts due to the fact that there's God, even if there's no human beings alive. But under your purview, why is it that we should presuppose that rationality is the thing that we should move towards for what is moral if there are no such thing as moral facts to begin with? How could you ever rationally ascertain what is moral if there are no moral facts?
Well, morality would just be contingent on the rationality. And if you just if you reject rationality, there's no point in having a conversation about like what you would or wouldn't believe is moral.
Do you believe that two people can act completely rational, but act completely differently in a given situation?
I guess if they have like a different set of observations regarding like a set of circumstances, then yeah.
Well, then you're in the exact same predicament again. Since my rationality and brain is different than your rationality and brain, how do we distinguish which one of us is doing the moral thing?
Well, that would be on the basis of like the moral primitives, right? Or like
no, what do you mean the moral primitives? You just said it was rationality that was what was going to determine what is moral. But if you and I can both act rationally, but in different ways, Why is it so? For instance, why would it be irrational to, like, I don't know, call every undesirable in a society? Why would that be an irrational thing to do, to act in that way?
Why would that be an irrational? Oh, well, because that would just be special pleading.
Why would it be irrational to act in that way?
Because that would be special pleading. I can send you the Rational Wiki article on why special
You're
pleading is
saying that the
irrational.
question I'm asking is fallacious?
No, I'm saying that, like, if you're calling people, if you're giving people asymmetric treatment without like a moral symmetry breaker, then that would be irrational behavior.
Okay,
basis of
because
special
their
pleading.
IQ, because they think their IQs are too low to be productive in society. It seems very rational. There's your continuum breaker, or there's your breaker, your symmetry breaker. It's no longer special pleading. It's very rational. Why shouldn't they do it?
Well, no, so it would have to be a relevant symmetry breaker, right? Because you could just affirm, then special pleading would never be.
What would an example of a
wrong.
relevant symmetry breaker being in a governance of a society using rationality?
I mean, you have symmetry breakers that you have all the time.
Then give me one.
I mean, self-defense, you even gave one yourself.
Well, wait a second. What's the symmetry breaker that isn't special pleading in the case of self-defense?
Right. Well, that would be based upon like arguments you would make, whatever was the world
What?
you wanted.
No,
on
what's
the
the
basis
what?
of like well-being or deontological.
Wait a second.
Arguments.
Wait a second. One more time. If you consider it to be special pleading, to make the affirmative statement, or to make the statement that if somebody rationally was governing a society and they said all the people who are under this IQ threshold, we're going to get rid of them because under our deontological rational system, right, they're not useful to society. They're not useful to it, right?
Yeah,
it's
you
no
would then
longer
have to demonstrate that like utility is like a relevant trait.
only if they utilized utility. Why should they do that? Utility can be irrational.
I'm sorry. Are you talking about utility in the sense of like the usefulness of the person, or utility?
No, the
in the sense of
utility in the useful sense of the actual theory of utilitarianism. It can be very irrational. In other words, you can end up in a quagmire of all kinds of things, like why is it that greater derivance of pleasure could be gotten by 20 people who were like, gangbanging a child, essentially, than what the child is getting.
So.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though. If you're talking about utility, no, it's not special pleading. If the society rationally comes to this conclusion over the rest of the society, why is it that the rationality itself should be adhered to if they're going to come to answers which you consider to be immoral, but they're not acting in an irrational way?
Well, the burden of proof would be on you to demonstrate the rationality of it. Like I can't.
I just did. They say if we make a nice program that makes sure nobody under this IQ threshold's ever born again, what is irrational about that?
Yeah, you would have to demonstrate that that's like morally relevant.
Oh, okay. So they say because society functions better, more people are happier, healthier, smarter, live longer, everything works way better for all the people who are left. Yeah, that seems highly rational, Nick. That seems highly, highly rational. And like there's a moral imperative there almost. So why shouldn't they do that, Nick?
Yeah, well, I mean, like then it would just get down to like the imperatives that are like given by utilitarianism end up being like.
And so we have
incoherent.
to adhere to a utilitarian's rationality. So your rationality, my
the opposite. I'm saying the opposite.
Oh, okay. But even then, right, you're still saying that both of these individual groups would be acting rationally, but they would both be doing things which are counter to each other's morality. So if there's no moral facts and two groups acting rationally cannot come to an agreement on what is moral, how can we ever have a society which engages in actual morality, Nick?
I don't understand what the contradiction that you're trying to elicit here.
Okay, well, I'm done because my time's allotted for that, and now I'm going to go pick on.
And I would also say that like none of that would demonstrate anything regarding the distinguishability of the universe from a godless one.
Yeah, again, right? But that's an attack on somebody else's position. That's fine, but when you have to defend your own, it sounds like fucking gibberish. I just want to let you know that.
Okay,
Joseph Swayden, over to your side, right? I didn't feel that you made a very compelling case either for your claims, and there's a few of them that I kind of wanted to attack. Why is it that your claims, as Nick asked so many times, how are they incompatible with naturalism?
Because people don't come back from the dead after 3 days.
They can come back from what's called and this happens all the time in foreign nations. In fact, the theory of what's called an African zombie. I don't know if you've heard of that or not. These are people who are buried dead for sometimes upwards of 2, 3, 4 days. And they call them zombies because they dig out of their own graves. Basically, they were considered clinically dead, but they didn't die. Some of that's due to drugs, which they're given, and it actually stops their heart, things like this, or at least this is what the claim is. So they can make the claim that somebody came back from the dead. I don't see why a naturalist couldn't say this could exist under their framework.
Well, I mean, the simple reality is that when we're talking about cases like the African zombie, and I mean, this is kind of something that actually has been addressed by a number of different what's the word I'm looking for, teachers on this matter. The resurrected zombies are, as you mentioned, they may be recovering from some sort of like drug-induced state, etc. What we're talking about when we're talking about the resurrection and its claims are that Christ came back triumphant. He was not a beaten person. He was not a zombie. That's one of the arguments I've heard before about what if he simply survived effectively. That's really what we're asking, because that's what's happening with the African zombies. The argument is that wouldn't be a very impressive Christ to come back, and frankly, if that came back, the argument that he could be killed or something right there. The Christ of the Gospels is not that weak upon his return. He shows that he can eat. He shows the marks in his hands and his feet. He can clearly change appearance, as he's not recognizable to...
Well, hang on, though. Nick eats. Nick could have cuts on his hand, and Nick could have cuts on his feet, and Nick can change his appearance. If Nick shaved his goatee and Nick got a haircut, I might not recognize Nick. I might not recognize him on the, you know what I mean? I might be like, who the hell are you? Right? Mm-hmm. So when you're making these kinds of arguments to try to be compelling, ultimately he's saying, from a naturalist worldview, from his worldview of empiricism and evidence and proof, right? How is it that these things, even if they're considered to be historically accurate, whether he believes in the miraculous part or not, why aren't they compatible with what he could foresee as people believing it, right? Even if it's not true, and live and exist as a fact inside of a naturalist worldview. That's his point, right?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the weak resurrected Jesus argument isn't the one that the authors of the Gospels chose. They did not present a Jesus that was like that. So the naturalistic worldview, the African zombie worldview, if we will, would be radically different than what they presented. So in other words, one could hold that there was some kind of naturalistic resurrection, but it wouldn't look like the one in the Gospels.
Yeah, I just failed to see how that could not coexist within the purview of the naturalist, which I think was Nick's point as he was kind of going through this.
Well, my point was that it's the observations on the basis of so that would be you make distinctions on the basis of observations. So we don't have information about whether or not Jesus resurrected from the dead, aside from having the information that we have presented to us on the basis of, the Gospels and the written accounts that we have, or the oral traditions and so on. That's our actual observations, right? And then filtered through time, right? So now, on the basis of this thing that we have now, right, we're trying to decide, is it impossible, even remotely, that the Jesus, that the naturalistic worldview could coexist with the information that were presented about Jesus? And I'm just failing to see those
how
two
it
things
doesn't,
be in
right?
any way
So I was
incompatible.
correct in this analogy that
But I mean, not necessarily that I'm committing to like, you know, the African zombie hypothesis.
No,
here.
that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is that you're just giving an example. That was my example, not yours, and I'm not
Sure.
attempting in any
Fair
way
enough.
to straw man your position. Only to state that alongside naturalism, which seems to be your point, maybe people wrote things down incorrectly, maybe based on observation, this got taken wrong, this got taken wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no smoking gun for you that would move you away from naturalism based on the arguments at least presented tonight, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, that's just not even like remotely necessary to believe that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead,
right?
In order to have the observations we have regarding Jesus's existence.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. I know I grilled both of you, but don't feel bad. I do it to everybody who comes on the Crucible. It's like I don't know what executive privilege or whatever, but that is a thing moderators do. Callers are going to be far worse than me, so don't feel bad. Fresh Pelmini, you've been waiting patiently in the background. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Patience is all I have for this debate. So, Nick, you started by saying that atheism is a subset of theism. By this, do you mean that we have both the same set of neutral empirical observations and that atheism is somehow the more parsimonious framework based on those observations?
Yeah, I guess in a way, if you wanted to put it that way.
Okay, so to make sure that we're really confirmed then. So you're basically saying that we're both looking at the same stuff. Atheism is just a simpler explanation of the same stuff.
Yeah, with simpler having that, you know, the asterisk that I attached to it. That simpler doesn't necessarily mean that like it takes fewer words to explain, right? Or that you could just say God did it, right? Because those are actually.
But it requires fewer assumptions, is what you're suggesting.
So it's actually not even necessarily about the assumptions, depending on what it is that you mean by that.
I guess parsimony then would be the way that you would.
Yeah, I guess you could say parsimonious. Yeah.
Okay. This seems to rely on the assumption that naturalistic interpretations of reality are somehow ideologically neutral. How did you? Well, for instance, you're basically saying, okay, look, I'm seeing a bunch of things, and this bunch of things has a simpler explanation, or requires less of an explanation, requires less stuff to it to make sense of all of it using naturalism. And naturalism just makes naturalism is just sort of the more default position that I should take. So, for instance, when you said to Joseph, or you said to Deacon Swayden, you said, look, the more likely explanation between the resurrection and an empty tomb with the body being stolen is the body being stolen. Well, how can you say that naturalism is sort of more neutral when naturalism itself has its own set of philosophical assumptions which aren't neutral? So, for instance, I assume you believe that only matter exists, right?
Well, I mean, I guess it would depend on like what it is that you meant by matter, and also like what it is that you meant by exist.
Is it only the natural world that has any being? There's only the natural world and whatever it consists of. Yeah, I guess there is no external sort of import to that.
Yeah, I guess if you want to put it that way, that's not quite. Yeah, with asterisks.
How did you come to that conclusion?
Right, so it would just be on the basis of like not having to accept anything beyond that as like in any way necessary.
Why though? Because that itself is an assumption that isn't based on an observation of the natural world.
I mean, like, I don't know. I guess like I'm not tracking why that like I mean, like you can still believe that like metaphysical things exist or things exist that are emergent properties.
But those aren't matter, right?
Yeah. Well, then okay, then I would just categorically reject then that matter is all that exists.
Okay, so what metaphysical things do you believe exists, and what sort of existence do metaphysical things have?
Well, I might be convinced about moral realism. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I
all
mean,
right.
Let's do that.
No, I mean, it's like then it like sort of depends. Like, for instance, like, does the idea of like the Fourier transform exist in like independent of like a mind existing? I mean, like, are we discovering or inventing math? Right? Those are just like, right? And then we're talking about things. Then it's just I feel like that's just like a definition game that we're kind of playing. Like, I don't know that necessarily cashes out to
So
anything.
does math exist in the physical world?
Hang on, I hate to cut this line of inquiry off, but Virginia Liu said she's not talking to Chad. She's throwing a big hissy fit in the chat. That's a timeout for being a woman, Virginia. Anyway, go ahead, Fresh.
That's the only appropriate way to deal with a woman.
I agree. Go ahead.
So where does, let's take the example of mathematics then. Where does math exist in the real world?
I don't know. Let's just say for the moment, like, I mean, like you don't necessarily need to be, I think, either a realist or an anti-realist in order to be a naturalist. But like, let's take an anti-realist view. I don't know. It could just be like a fiction that we invent.
How could you be a naturalist and be a realist about maths?
Gonna have to wrap it up quick, Fresh. We've got other callers after you.
Okay. Well, let me just switch to another line of inquiry then. So do you believe that observation is a neutral process?
I suppose it would depend on what you meant by neutral, but I guess in a sense, probably not, right? Because like different people could have different observations. I guess, I don't know. That's a good question. I guess like, because there is like necessarily like an interpretation part to any observation.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well, good. Okay. Just quickly then. So would you say then the issue then becomes, and I suppose this becomes the point, a point that is also relevant to Father Joseph here. When you talk about the discussion between whose interpretation of the empty tomb is the most correct or the most obvious, doesn't that just become sort of the wrong question at that point, as much as because both of you are dealing with data, but you're just looking at the data with a different philosophical framework, right? So the question then becomes, well, who has the philosophical framework that makes sense of it the most? Because both of you are coming through the lens of having certain interpretive assumptions. And certain
if you want to say like whose framework makes the most sense or like best explains it, like I already said at the beginning, like God is categorically the best you could just like point to anything and just say God's the best explanation for that. God's the best explanation for why I bought a 6-string guitar instead of a 7.
Well,
right? Like,
I mean, he is though, right?
Yeah.
Like he really is the best explanation, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, like, so you could just like say that, and I would just take that to be trivially true.
Yeah, right. But maybe not trivially, maybe just true.
Right. I mean, like, so that would be the contention, right? Like, would be that the thing is then that like we would then have to like accept any supernatural explanation that came along, right? Because it would just be the supernatural explanations, God being one of them.
You wouldn't have to do that though, because you could start narrowing down the necessary character, or you can narrow down between various different God claims by looking at their coherence as claims. So, for instance, if I was going to take a look at Islam's claim of the supernatural versus Christianity's, or specifically Eastern Orthodox Christianity's claim of the supernatural, I would say that there are very good logical arguments to suggest that the Islamic God doesn't just not have enough evidence to support it, that it is a logical impossibility. And one of the reasons for that is, for instance, its doctrine of the transcendence of God. We can go into those sorts of details. But the point being there is I don't have to accept that supernatural claim. I would, on the face of it, have to be open to supernatural claims. That doesn't mean you can't whittle down supernatural claims and say there are certain correct supernatural claims and certain incorrect supernatural claims.
Yeah, but I would also take that to be affirming the consequent, because someone could come up with like an insularly coherent idea, right? There's like no basis in reality.
But I think what he's saying is that absent the qualia which the Christian God has, and absent the qualia that Christianity has, that it is the only thing that can make metaphysical claims which is coherent, and therefore you can rule all of the other ones out. I think that's his point.
Basically, I would reduce to like I don't think when you're talking the level of paradigms. So what I've sort of been touching on here with what I've been raising is the notion that everything's interpreted through a network of beliefs and a network of foundational beliefs, which are interrelated. They don't actually build on each other stepping stone by stepping stone. They act as a coherent web where everyone has them, and there is only one possible paradigm which can make sense of everything. Like you can have coherent, maybe at a very small level, you might have a coherent belief which is a map onto reality. But when you're talking about paradigms, which are the very networks by which we make sense of our lived experience and of reality in general, there aren't pretty much any systems at all that are coherent and mappable onto reality, because they start becoming world encompassing.
Are you going to claim that like if we assume that we have like a godless universe, let's just like hypothetically think about that for a moment, and then intelligent beings evolve out of that, do you think that they could make metaphysical claims?
I think that is a logical impossibility, because the idea of a godless universe destroys the very possibility of knowledge and destroys the very possibility of the ontological existence of metaphysical categories.
So you don't, so you would just think that like, so if thinking beings came out and then like came up in this universe, that they wouldn't be left with observations that they think that they are ascribing to what you would call metaphysical?
The problem with that is the fact that the thinking being wouldn't actually be able to arise. Logically speaking, the thinking being wouldn't be able to arise in that environment, because knowledge itself, which is a concept that requires an agent to distinguish between claims, requires an end to which those claims are sort of directed. So it requires a teleology. So it requires those two things. You can't have, well, if we're going to focus
does it need you're saying it needs an external teleology?
Well, knowledge requires a teleology. So
right, but that doesn't necessarily need to be external.
Well, with the teleology, see, the thing is, knowledge itself is mapping onto external reality, right? If something...
All right, Fresh, you got to wrap it up. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll just finish with this. Basically speaking, if something doesn't have a purpose, it's impossible to actually have any claim or understanding of the thing in itself. And so if that's the case, well, then you basically, in a godless universe that has no direction by definition, because it's just a chaotic flux, which has just spontaneously come to be, there is no knowledge which is possible at all.
Yeah, well, I would just claim that would be wrong, because as soon as you have thinking beings that evolve in this like godless universe, purpose has now, and those beings ascribe purpose to things and ascribe teleology. Now you have the teleology required.
Okay, you can't keep going, Fresh. I'm sorry. I appreciate the call.
Yeah. I would just say that, like, yeah, I mean, again, like, I would need some like demonstration that's like, you know, that there's something that's like, you know, incompatible with like what we observe, right? So you could like claim that like, oh, well, what's your fundamental basis for knowledge if, you know, God isn't there to be the capital T truth, right? And so for me, it would just be like, what's our observation here, that we believe that we have observations that we ascribe truth to, or that we ascribe, you know, our, you know, certain beliefs to, or in this case, moral facts. I would just say that like, we would then need some way in which that set of observations was incompatible with naturalism.
Now, real quick, Riculous. Can you give me the thumbs up on your camera? Can you turn your camera on for just a second? Because I don't recognize the handle. And just give me a thumbs up. Nobody else can see you, bro. Okay, you can turn it back off now. All right. Go ahead with your question, man. Riculous.
Okay, so, Nick, do you believe that anything exists outside of matter?
This again. Well, I mean, again, like, so if you're talking about like metaphysical claims, or like things that like for which we like ascribe values
like
to,
the laws of logic.
Yeah, I mean, like in terms of like existing outside of our minds, like, are you asking me if we are inventing or discovering?
Yeah, outside of our minds. If humans didn't exist, would the laws of logic exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I truly don't know.
They're discovered, right? The universe would still have to act in a logical way, regardless of your thought pattern.
Right. Yeah. Like it would be like a thing that's like we wouldn't, like obviously like the law of like, let's say identity or something along those lines, like
Would always have to be true, regardless and independent of human thought, wouldn't it?
yeah, I would say that would have to be true. Yeah, actually, I don't know. Then the logical entailment might be that like
That
because
God
I think
exists. That's the
no,
logical
I was about to say
entailment.
that moral realism is true, right? Because
Yeah.
like I take morality to be essentially just an extension of like the laws of logic. Yeah, I don't know. All right, we'll go on. What was your?
Yeah, no worries. I have one more question. Do you agree that God either exists or doesn't exist? There's no in between.
Yeah, I would take that to be true.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's all I had.
All right, Riculus, thank you so much for the call, and I appreciate it. We still have time for a couple more callers if anybody else wants to call in while you guys stack up, because I know you got the link a little bit late. I am going to go through some super chats, but we will still take callers, at least a couple of more for these guys. And by the way, thanks to both of our participants for taking the time out of their night for coming on the Crucible this evening. We truly do appreciate it. It's a rough place, right? The Crucible's always been one of the tougher debate platforms to be on, and we are always appreciative of people who come on. It's a tough crowd, but I think ultimately it's a pretty fair crowd, pretty forgiving crowd. So, Nick, give us your best Danny Filth impression.
Oh man, I actually still have like a Cradle of Filth shirt, and it is. I was thinking like, oh, I should have worn like a Slayer shirt for this debate.
Yes, that would have been awesome. I love,
especially because the front man's actually Catholic. Yeah,
love Slayer. Yeah.
I don't know. We're gonna have to pay extra though for me to do musical impersonations.
Wicked Wally for $5. Oh, come on, man! He's $20. You can't like give it a shot. You can't. Come on, give it a shot.
Yeah, I used to try to do like that inhale. Like scream, but it just ends up sounding like a squawk instead. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, he always does that like high pitch that like, I don't know. There we go. I've embarrassed myself fully on camera.
Spyro Fluoropolis, you've been waiting in the background. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, you can hear me all right, yeah?
We can hear you, yeah.
Perfect. I only have one question, then I'm going to bow out. If you didn't have breakfast this morning, how would that make you feel?
Oh, I actually didn't. All I had was coffee. And
how do you feel?
I don't know. I got home and then I was really hungry, and then I had pizza leftovers, and then I so I don't know.
Got it.
And that's on an empirical modality, not on
it makes sense from all modalities, I assure you. Yeah. Wicked Wally for $5 says, I'm not saying you all need to join me funding a cat camp, but if you don't, you probably prefer, well, I can't read the rest. That's ridiculous. I can't believe you said such a horrific thing. The Smoky Patriot says, got to keep the pack filled for $1.99. Appreciate that very much. Also, Propaganda LTD. Thank you for being a member now for 3 months. Thank you to all of our new members. Let me move over to the Dono chat side here, guys. We will read those off too. $10 from Anonymous says, I thought this was supposed to be a debate and not a gentle rebuke. I guess that's what happens when you concede in your opening statement and say that you're not going to be making any arguments. I don't know who that was for. $5 comes in from Mark and Mandy, who says, finish him. And then he puts up the Mortal Kombat, like the little Mortal Kombat insignia, which I think is kind of funny.
Fatality.
Yeah. Imperious, where did you go? You're right here, right? We'll take you last caller for the evening before we wrap the debate up and let these guys go about their merry way. There you are. Imperious, can you hear us okay?
Good evening. Good evening. Yes, I'm sorry. I had a little connection issues there.
Well, it seems like they're unfucked now. Go ahead when you're ready, man.
Okay, just a quick couple questions. I caught the end of the debate. Thank you both for coming on again. Father, I just want to say, first of all, I love the background. It's amazing. Thank you so much. Second of all, Mr. Nick, can we agree that the creation of existence comes down to three categories: necessity, randomness, or divinity, correct?
I don't know. I feel like that's so vague. I feel
Well,
like I'm
it would
having a
either
hard time
be
like parsing.
the universe or time or whatever would either be
Okay.
randomly created by chance, necessity for it to be created, or created under a divine inspiration, correct?
Keeping in mind
I
all
don't know,
the
because I
variants,
guess that would
presumably.
presuppose a set of laws of physics by which only those three things could be the things which generate universes.
Well, keep in mind that there's variation within the things. So if you're talking about like whether it's a God the Father or a flying spaghetti monster, there's still a God.
Yeah, I'm
So
just talking in general. I'm just talking not specifically the Christian God here, even though we could get into that, but I don't think Andrew wants me around that long. But yes, just generalizing. That would be the three categories of creation, correct?
I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe. I don't know.
well, what else could it be?
Well, first let's go that. Yeah, exactly. What else could it be other than those three?
I don't think that that's like I don't think that that follows that you could ask such a question like what could it be, and that would demonstrate that claim. Like,
well, if the universe, if it was presupposed that it was a necessity for it to be the way it is to be created, if it was randomly created by whatever you would like to say, the forces of gravity, the laws of gravity, Newton's laws of motion, or string theory,
things
or string
inside
theory,
the universe, or
no, existence, any kind of existence.
Any kind of existence.
Very broad category.
Oh, so I guess of things inside the universe, things happen either out of necessity, I guess divinity, or I guess randomness. I guess I don't even know that those are like mutually exclusive. Like what kind of phenomenon? Like you mean like the existence of like I don't know,
anything.
This piece of sandpaper existing? Like was either
yeah, you could take that. Yeah. Is there any other possibility than necessity, randomness, or divine inspiration, divinity, however you want to speak?
You could always say creation.
Well, I guess I don't know what it would mean for like divinity. Like, would divinity mean that this piece of sandpaper was poofed into existence by God?
That's why I went with creation. It was created by a person.
So now are we?
Yeah,
talking
it was
about...
either created. It was either created out of necessity, that it had to be there.
You're gonna listen, Imperious. Whatever your ultimate point is, you have
okay. Anyway, let me move on.
Quickly.
I'm sorry.
So you're talking about like a person's mind.
Okay. Well, let's. I'll just suppose that if it's. Okay, let me put it this way. Do you believe or do you understand the levels of scrutiny or how you would determine truth?
I'm sorry. Oh. I don't understand the question.
Well, okay.
Do I understand?
I'm trying to get to you to look at, if nothing can be completely proven 100%, what do you look at to be your explanation of what is true? That's all. I would say that would be my question. Or do you come from 100% fact that no matter what, every single time, everything is 100% true? Because that's not fact. Or do you look at your standard of proof? And if you're looking at standard of proof, you would have to say that looking at things like the 209 universal constants, the mathematics itself points to divine creation. Randomness, it would be 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. And
so that would presuppose a number of things, like for one, that they're independent. But like, for instance, if you live in a three-dimensional universe and you have a particular speed of light and you have a coefficient of electrical permittivity, then the constant for magnetic permeability is set for you, right? So as soon as you turn one knob, you turn the other knob, the third one moves automatically. Right?
Okay,
so
this
like,
is all
Imperious. I'm just saying. I'm trying to point out that.
I guess I don't know. Like if you have if you had only one shot at building a universe, and you could only have one set of constants that we already empirically know. Like there's simulations of like alternate universes, one that completely omits the weak force, for instance, the weak nuclear force, so straight up takes one of the nuclear forces directly out of the equation, and you end up with stars that, like, for instance, last much shorter, because the weak nuclear force is very important as part of nuclear fusion. But there's certainly not inconceivable. It hasn't been demonstrated that the current laws of physics that we exist in are the only possible laws of physics, where it's been demonstrated that, like, we would only have one possible shot at being in a universe that exists with a set of laws of physics that creates intelligent thinking beings, because the anthropic principle, who else would have those observations but somebody that lives in such a universe?
Okay, this is pot smoking talk, bro. So
yeah, so I guess
you better wrap this shit up fucking quick, man.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I'm trying to point out the fact is that the mathematics don't point to your conclusion. The mathematics would point to divine inspiration, because if you're talking about necessity, the necessity of the mathematics is much higher on odds and probability to be not necessity. Same thing with randomized. You would the mathematical probabilities point to a divine creator.
All right, I appreciate it, Imperious, and I wasn't trying to hang on real quick. I wasn't trying to cut you off. There was a time constraint, and I was very charitable with it, Imperious, and I appreciate your call in. Don't think I don't, but a little too much of that going on, maybe, Imperious. Just like maybe think about it. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, you two, go ahead.
I was just going to point out that the anthropic principle is like the god of the gaps for the people who believe in simulation theory. The basis of it is literally just, it has to happen that way. That's the same as just going, God did it.
No, I mean, like, I'm just saying that, like, what he's saying is just not incompatible with naturalism. So,
right, but I'm just saying that even naturalism has its own little God did it theory.
Now,
it's just phrased different.
Oracle, I saw you back there. I'll bring your call in real quick, and we'll get through your call. If you still want to do that, we still have some time left on the clock. These guys knew the time constraints. We still have a little bit of time for callers. I did see you back there. I know Imperious sucked up all of your great time with his over-analyzing, over-winded, dope-smoking nonsense, but if you want to call back in, man, I'll give you some time to ask your questions. These guys took the time out of their night. I'm sure that they would actually like to hear them. Nick has been remarkably good faith this evening, which we here at the Crucible appreciate very much. Please bring back the Crucible randomizer. We will do that. I'll ask Joseph if he wants to do the randomizer. I think he'd have a lot of fun with that.
I have no idea what that is.
It's where we bring you on and I give you random debate topics and people call in and you can go rounds with them, but it's mostly politics and it's a lot of fun. Anyway, Oracle, if you can still hear me, you can come back in. Just so you know, you can come back in. You're the next caller on the docket. I'll bring you on. You can ask your questions before I wrap up. You were waiting patiently in the background. I want to make sure you get a turn in. So yeah, like we can definitely do that. And then let's see, add a super chats on the dono side too. You guys aren't exactly raking me in the cash this evening, by the way.
Well, I will say, Andrew, that I think you, I don't know if necessarily you did it, but I think it might be a little bit more convincing actually that moral realism is accurate, because I take the laws of rationality to exist independent of minds. And I always tried, I don't know, the argument that I've been working with a little bit was that, like, by virtue of the fact that you have that you have agency, that you like, again, like, it would be special pleading for you to behave in such a fashion that that, like, basically treated others differently from yourself in the absence of, like, relevant moral characteristics. So I think that it would follow that, like, if rationality is real, like, contingent upon just simply the existence of a moral agent, that moral agent would then have moral imperatives that would exist, that would be as real
and they
as
would
rational.
And then those would lead to categorical imperatives, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
So I mean, just something to think about.
All right, fine.
Something to think about. But you have been remarkably good faith, Nick. You're welcome back to the Crucible whenever you'd like to come back on. Based Oracle, go ahead whenever you're ready, man.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Sorry, I'm a bit late. I just wanted to say both of you, I thought, did a good job. With that said, Nick, pointing towards you, I have a question. So I'm not really taking a side in this question, but I want to know legitimately, because I do think you've been good faith. I mostly disagree with you, but what do you think the pro is? What do you think the positive would be if you were correct? I know I'm coming from a different angle. I'm not looking for all the
Yeah.
semantic, right? But what do you think the pro would be, just simply in 5 seconds?
Oh yeah, I guess like I would say like just if something is like rationally correct, then I would like, I mean, I feel like I feel compelled to fight for that, right? And so like I think that's, I don't know, that's just like my sort of view on that.
No, I understand your basis, what you just said, but I'm asking what the pro would be.
Like what's yeah, I guess I would say like just
be.
Caller, I just want to make sure I can get this clarified. Are you asking like how would it have a positive impact on society? Is that what you're
Correct.
asking? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I just think that like if we were more rational, it couldn't hurt. I don't know, maybe.
Okay, I agree with you in that sense, but that still isn't a pro. You just said it couldn't hurt, but I'm asking what the positive would be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I guess I don't have any like empirics of like the net if there is like in fact like some net well-being increase.
Okay, that's fine.
happens,
That's fine.
yeah.
So with
But-
that said, Father Joseph, what do you think the pro would be if you're correct?
Well, to put it simply, I hate to use a cliche, but you see it at every football game. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that we are more than just the life on this earth, and we are destined for more, and God, who loves us, wants us to be united with him. And that's the purpose of all this in the end. This is just a stepping stone to either heaven or hell, and I want everyone to go to heaven, as many people as can.
Except you, Based Oracle. That's it.
I don't think that.
No, he didn't say that. He didn't say that. I'm just joking with you, bro. Go ahead with your follow-up.
Yeah, so what I'm kind of getting at, and again, I'm looking at this sort of neutrally as much as I can, but I do agree more with what Father Joseph is saying. And so with that said, do you, Nick, see you really have no positive, right? If you're correct. Whereas what Father Joseph said, I would agree. If that's true, there's a big net positive. And I'm going to speak for him a little bit here, but we're talking about love, right? In a sense, right?
Yeah,
God
but
being love.
Problem is
And
also he could be wrong though, right?
That-
he
that's
could be,
not
for
my
instance,
question.
worshiping like the wrong God.
Right, but he's
That-
saying, what if, for instance, he was wrong? What if Joseph was wrong? And then it becomes almost Pascal's
Yeah, I mean,
wager,
this is Pascal's wager. Yeah,
Right,
this
but-
still doesn't
but
help me
the thing-
distinguish.
But the thing is that it's more than Pascal's wager, though, because of Christianity, we can look at the real implications of society and how it has affected history for 2,000 years. And seemingly even right now in the current society you live in, Nick, the positives for people who are religious are overwhelming in comparison to those who are secularists. Whereas anybody who makes the claim that they just base everything off of rationality or atheism or secularism, whatever it may be, their mental illness rates are much higher. Their children have much worse outcomes. Almost everything that you look at, even their children, they're thinking themselves out of existence. Atheists don't have kids. The religious are having all the kids. It's like, if this really seems like it's a very poisonous doctrine for society, doesn't it?
I mean, I don't know if you wanted like if we could do this whole thing as another debate and like,
Oh, of course.
I mean, if you want to do a country by country correlation and then
country
look at,
by
like,
country, you'll find that this is true universally.
okay.
It's actually insane. Like you would never think it would stack up that nicely, but it really does.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, if you do I mean, like, again, correlation doesn't help us establish causality, right? So
No,
it
I know,
means
but Pew
with,
Research helps us establish causality, right? when
I
people
think
go,
that's
well,
correlation.
yeah, but I mean, what is anything in your worldview except a strong enough correlate to make it reality?
Right. Well, I mean, like, if you're talking, like, are you saying what is?
I'm saying that if the correlate, if you're like 95% sure that the correlate is this, it's like a 95% correlation, you would take that as fact, wouldn't you?
Or mostly fact, close to fact.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, like, I mean, that's just like trivially easy to.
That's
false.
not trivial in this case. That's just like, that's a big part is everything in your worldview is
country by
correlation.
country. Smoking, the countries that smoke the most have the highest longevity. I don't know if you're familiar with that fact.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that would be a correlate because if you look at the greater impacts in comparison to the self-reports than you do religion, you'll note that it's much lower on the correlate chain as far as that data goes, right?
So you would then say that the causally smoking lets you live longer?
No, I'd
not
say
of course
doesn't.
a personal attack on
I'd
you.
say it doesn't let you live
Yeah.
longer. But just because, so that
Two
would
things
be an
are
example
correlated.
of correlation not equaling causation. But if the correlation is strong enough, you would consider that the cause, because how else could you do anything?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like, yeah. If you want to get to that again, if you want to change the modality on it, then yes, technically, I mean, if you want to think about it that way, then any research article that attempts to establish causality is, in fact, a correlation in temporal space.
Right.
But
So
you
I'm
need
just
that
saying
temporal.
the correlation is so powerful.
But you would need that. Yeah, but you would need that temporal component to establish the antecedent.
Right. So when somebody says I had kids because God told me so, I'd say the correlation's like 100%, right? Or 99% or 98%.
Right. Yeah, you're one
right?
of those. Yeah, you're like an ultra pronatalist. Yeah.
But I mean, if they did say that, right? They did say, hey, I had kids because God said so. Don't you think that's like a really strong correlate? That's much stronger than, oh, and I also smoke, right? Yeah. Oh, and I also smoke. God didn't tell me to do that, but he did tell me to have kids, and that's why I had kids. Don't you think that's a stronger correlate for the having of the kids than the smoking at that point?
Well, I mean, again, then all you could establish is that it's like a ultra, like, let's just say for the second that it is ultra useful. Like, we don't even need to have the debate. I'll just grant for you. Let's say it is extremely useful. How do I know that it's not just an extremely useful fiction?
Nick, you're a really smart guy. I almost think you're too smart for your own good. Like, your whole position is devil's advocate. Well, what if, right?
I mean, I just like my position's been the same thing from the start. Is like, how
debate, right?
How do I?
No, I'm with you. I'm just saying, like,
yeah. Well, I'm making a negative.
You're very good at getting
right?
around things.
Well, what I'm saying is the two things are indistinguishable from each other, right? How could I make that case besides to ask you for a distinguishing characteristic and for you to show up empty-handed, right? So, like, if you do want to like have some observation that you want to present to me, wherein that view is like incompatible with naturalism or is incompatible with viewing God through like just naturalistically intelligible means, that, like, I guess just the means by which somebody's life could improve from religion are completely naturalistically intelligible to me, right? So I wouldn't understand why the acceptance of the God claim would be required in order for somebody to say that, like, they gathered belief and then their life improved.
He gave me, just so you know, he gave me complete and total unilateral control over the little monsters, right? So yes, he did, in fact, even though I don't, but he did. So anyway, that aside, caller, thank you so much for calling in. I really appreciate it. Have yourself a wonderful night. That is a great place to stop this debate and stop the call-in section. We got through all the super chats, all the callers. Before we go, though, Nick, again, you have been remarkably good faith tonight. Come back. We'll have the natalist debate if you'd like to have it.
Oh, man. I tried listening to like the first 10 minutes of the debate between you and Vosh, and then I just like couldn't.
I don't blame you.
I was unable to.
Yeah, but I think we would have a much better one probably. But anyway, you're welcome to if you'd ever like to. But in any case, you're welcome back whenever you'd like to. If a proposition catches your eye. Until then, why don't you shout out whatever social media you'd like to for everybody who's watching?
Yeah, I guess you can find me hanging around the Crucible Discord. I go by Anti-Car Nick. That's an anti-carnist Nick. And I guess I have a YouTube channel that I have recently started posting some videos on. I guess I think it goes by the same handle. I should probably look that up, right?
It's anti-carnist Nick.
Yeah, I think I just posted under Nick the Anti-Carnist. So
well, if we can turn you into a deontologist, perhaps we can turn you into a meat eater as well. Father Joseph Swayden, same thing to you. Go ahead and shout out whatever media you would like to.
NFTU.net is available on YouTube, on Gab, on Twitter. We're doing more, we're doing more shows. And again, go to NFTU.net. I always ask people if they can support us if possible. Click on the large support banner to find out how. I want to thank everyone both of you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much.
More than welcome. It was a great conversation. Gentlemen, have a wonderful night. Well, that's it for us. Tomorrow night, be right back here when I take on. I'll tell you the story real quick. Jara, this like OnlyFans chick who was on Destiny stream or whatever. I was setting the debate up with this chick long before that stream happened. It was like just a coincidence. It was pure coincidence that happened. A guy in the Discord was like, Andrew, please. You must debate this woman. She brings me great bodily pain to listen to her overbearing screeching and stupidity. And I was like, well, awesome Crucible member. I will do this thing for you because that's the kind of guy that I am. It's just the kind of guy that I am. I said, yes, I'll do it. So I went about the long and arduous process of getting that debate set up, and it's happening tomorrow night. So whoever that member is who asked for that, I don't remember his name now, but you're welcome. You're welcome, right? Just for you, the OnlyFans lawyer. The OnlyFans, I can't wait. The OnlyFans lawyer. Be right back tomorrow evening for that debate. Alex PWF will be moderating, but it's a 1v1, not a panel. Gonna enjoy it very much, and I'm sure all of you will too. Will I be talking over her? Absolutely. If she does woman prattle, I'm going to be talking over her. I mean, but they all do woman prattle, so you have to. You have to. There's no choice. You know what I mean? There's no choice. Otherwise, they never shut up. I have to even do that with my wife sometimes. I'm like, honey, sweetheart, I love you, but shut the fuck up, right? Just shut up. I don't want to hear anymore. It happens sometimes. Anyway, from all of us, now I'm going to die, right? Look what you guys did. Now I'm literally going to die. She's like, we're going to walk upstairs. There's going to be like a frying pan waiting for me. I appreciate that, by the way. And the attempt to sound bass, it's going to be what's on the headstone. Died attempting to sound bass. From all of us here at the Crucible to all of you out there in Crucible land, have a wonderful night. I see you backstage, Nick. Hang tight.